Many people can agree that Dexter is not a show for the weak, and that beneath its calm narration lies something deeply unsettling. From Dexter Morgan's strict code that targets other killers to the methodical way he blends into everyday life, the series presents a version of a serial killer that feels controlled, calculated, and disturbingly rational. But what if I told you that parts of Dexter are rooted in real life, and that the person often cited as the inspiration behind the character followed rules of his own? Rules that were far messier and far more disturbing than anything shown on screen. This video will explore the real-life inspiration behind Dexter, comparing it directly to the show, and will uncover what had to be changed to make the story even watchable. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born in 1954 in Brazil, and from the very beginning of his life, he was surrounded by violence. Reports indicate that his childhood was marked by instability and abuse, and Rodrigues himself later claimed that his first violent impulses surfaced at a very young age. By his early teens, he had already begun acting on those impulses, setting him on a path that would eventually make him one of Brazil's most infamous figures. According to investigative reporting, Rodrigues would later describe his early years as the moment he realized he was capable of harming others without hesitation. By the time he was 14 years old, Rodrigues committed his first known killing, targeting a local political figure he believed had wronged his family. What followed was not a single isolated act, but the beginning of a pattern. Over the next several years, Rodrigues moved through different regions of Brazil and became known for targeting individuals he believed were criminals, people he claimed deserved punishment. As All That's Interesting explains, he was known as one of Brazil's most infamous serial killers, and he himself claimed responsibility for over 100 deaths, with authorities confirming dozens. Rodrigues was eventually arrested in 1973 and sentenced to an extraordinary prison term. However, due to Brazilian sentencing laws that cap the maximum time served, he was released after 34 years behind bars. During and after his incarceration, Rodrigues became a controversial public figure, even launching a YouTube channel where he spoke about crime and warned viewers against following the path he had taken. According to coverage of his life, he continued to describe himself as someone who targeted criminals rather than innocent people, reinforcing the vigilante image that would later define his public reputation. His story came to an abrupt end in March 2023 when Rodrigues was killed outside a residence in Sao Paulo, a death authorities described as a targeted attack. And while many online came to label him the Brazilian Dexter, this comparison only works on the surface, because when you look closer, the reality of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, his lack of structure, his impulsive violence, and the chaotic nature of his life stands in stark contrast to the carefully controlled and fictional world of Dexter Morgan, which is exactly where the differences between the two truly begin. On paper, both are described as killers who targeted criminals, but the way they operated couldn't be further apart. Dexter is written as hyper-intelligent, obsessively careful, and ritualistic to the point of pathology. Every kill follows a process: confirmation, preparation, control, and cleanup. Pedro's real-life behavior was far less refined. He was impulsive, openly violent, and careless by comparison, operating without forensic certainty, without a consistent method, and without the kind of long-term restraint that has kept Dexter hidden for decades. That contrast is why real reporting never frames Pedro as a calculated genius, but as something far more volatile. An article described him plainly as a self-described vigilante murderer who claimed to have killed dozens of criminals, a phrase that lacks the precision, structure, and moral choreography Dexter's character is built on. Even sources that lean into comparison quietly reveal the gap. All That's Interesting, while acknowledging the nickname, refers to Pedro being known as the real-life Dexter, before immediately grounding the claim in chaos, noting that authorities confirmed at least 70 murders. That number alone exposes the lack of control. Dexter's entire identity hinges on not escalating, on keeping his violence contained so it doesn't spiral outward. Pedro's didn't. Dexter avoids collateral damage because the narrative demands it. Pedro's actions unfolded in a real environment where violence breeds more violence, attention breeds retaliation, and certainty doesn't exist. Dexter's intelligence is exaggerated to keep the fantasy alive. Pedro's real-world decisions were often reactionary, driven by anger, revenge, and circumstance rather than a consistently applied code. And this is where the danger starts, not just in reality, but in how we consume fiction. Dexter is written to be admired for his discipline, his intelligence, and his restraint, but idolizing that version of vigilantism blurs an important line. The real-world version shows what happens when people take the idea of justice through violence and remove the narrative guardrails. Pedro's life didn't play out like a puzzle box, it collapsed into prison sentences, notoriety, and eventually a violent death. Authorities later summarized his end with chilling simplicity: the suspects fled after the crime. And that's why the real-world version of Dexter wouldn't just be disturbing to watch, it would be unbearable. Without the illusion of intelligence holding everything together, what you're left with isn't a dark anti-hero, it's just simply chaos. And that's exactly why television had to tame Dexter, because the truth left unfiltered isn't entertainment, it's just downright disturbing. Because when you imagine this real-life version translated directly to the screen, it stops being compelling and becomes deeply uncomfortable. Dexter works as a character because his violence is filtered through intelligence and a carefully crafted ritual. The audience is never meant to feel lost inside the chaos. Every episode reassures you that there are rules, that the killings follow a structure, and that Dexter is always thinking several steps ahead. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's real-life code, by contrast, was far more flawed, inconsistent, and even dangerous. Even if he claims to target criminals, the criteria were often based on personal judgment, emotion, or circumstance rather than certainty. This real-world vigilantism doesn't pause to double-check any evidence, and this lack of proof is exactly what television carefully avoids when it wants viewers to keep watching. What makes Pedro's story disturbing rather than entertaining is that it lacks intention beyond violence itself. Dexter's rituals, even if horrifying, serve a narrative function. They slow the pace, create tension, and give the audience a sense of control. Pedro's actions were faster, harsher, and far less contained. There's no suspense in watching someone act impulsively, there's only dread. And unlike Dexter, Pedro didn't exist in a world that conveniently bent to protect him. His choices drew attention, retaliation, and consequences in ways that would feel repetitive and bleak on screen. Instead of clever escapes and near misses, you'd be watching a spiral, one act leading inevitably to another without insight or even growth. There's also the psychological weight. Dexter constantly reflects on what he is, even if that reflection is self-serving. Pedro's story doesn't offer that interiority in a way that could anchor a long-form series. Real life doesn't give you confessional voiceovers or philosophical framing, it gives you headlines and aftermath. That's why even serious journalism avoids romantic language, with most articles describing as a deranged serial killer, stripping away any illusion of heroism and leaving only the reality of repeated violence. That phrasing matters because it refuses to soften what he was. Ultimately, a show that portrayed Pedro faithfully wouldn't feel like Dexter at all. It wouldn't be thrilling, ironic, or darkly funny. It would be grim, repetitive, and exhausting. Because without ritual, intelligence exaggerated for fiction, and narrative balance, violence stops being a story and becomes a spectacle of harm. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Dexter had to be carefully engineered to be watchable. The real-life version doesn't need to be adapted because once you see it clearly, you realize it was never meant to be entertainment in the first place. If you want to dive even deeper into these topics with exclusive videos, guaranteed replies, and your name featured at the end of every upload, you can become a channel member for just $2.99. It helps out a ton and keeps this content going. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to keep the conversation going, hop into the Discord where we talk about all your favorite shows and media. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.